By April 1945, the German U-boat force was no longer a weapon of war. It was a hunted population. The Atlantic that had once been a killing ground had turned hostile in every direction. Allied air cover was near continuous. Radar, HFDF direction finding, escort carriers, and hunter-killer groups had erased the invisibility U-boats once relied on. The ports that still flew German flags were either cut off, bombed into paralysis, or already preparing to surrender. Orders from command were sporadic, contradictory, or simply irrelevant to the conditions at sea. For crews still submerged in this final phase, the reality was brutal. Returning to port was often impossible. Remaining at sea meant eventual detection, mechanical failure, or starvation. Surrender was theoretically an option, but in practice it depended on location, timing, and the willingness of Allied forces to accept it without violence. In contested waters, surfacing could mean immediate destruction before any intent was understood. This was the environment facing one damaged U-boat and its exhausted crew in the closing weeks of the war. The boat itself was no longer combat-capable. Mechanical issues had accumulated over months of continuous operations, worn engines, unreliable batteries, compromised seals, and reduced dive performance. Spare parts were unavailable. Repairs that would once have been routine could no longer be made at sea. Every dive carried risk. Every surface run invited detection. The crew knew the strategic situation, even if they lacked precise information. Radio traffic was sparse and filtered, but enough had leaked through to confirm what everyone already suspected. Berlin was collapsing. Naval command structures were fragmenting. Admirals issued standing orders that no longer matched reality. In some cases, U-boats were still being told to patrol areas that Allied forces controlled completely. Morale aboard late-war U-boats was complex. There was fear, certainly, but also resignation. Ideological commitment had eroded under the weight of survival. These were sailors first, not politicians. Many were barely in their 20s. They had spent weeks or months sealed inside steel hulls, breathing recycled air, sleeping next to torpedoes they would never fire. The war had narrowed to the next hour, the next dive, the next mechanical noise that might mean death. The captain faced a set of options that were all bad. Staying with the U-boat meant eventual failure. Fuel was limited. Battery capacity was declining. Allied patrols were tightening. A disabled U-boat could not outrun aircraft or escorts. Once detected, escape was unlikely. Even if the boat survived immediate attack, damage would compound until sinking became inevitable. Surrender was theoretically safer, but only under ideal conditions. Surfacing near Allied forces required signaling intent, trusting that those signals would be recognized, and hoping no local commander chose caution over mercy. In the fog of late-war operations, mistakes were common and fatal. Several U-boats that attempted surrender were fired upon before contact could be clarified. There was also the question of geography. Neutral ports were distant or inaccessible. Coastal waters were mined. Harbors were controlled or blockaded. Reaching a safe surrender point required navigation, fuel, and time, all of which were running out. The most dangerous option was abandonment. Leaving a U-boat at sea meant exposure to cold, waves, and patrols in small craft not designed for long-range travel. It meant relying on navigation tools meant for emergency use, not sustained voyages. It meant separating from the relative safety of steel walls, however compromised those walls had become. And yet, this option began to look like the only one that offered agency. The decision did not involve the entire crew. It could not. A lifeboat could not carry everyone. Supplies were limited. Weight mattered. Visibility mattered. A small group could move quietly. A large group would be noticed. 7 men volunteered. Their reasons varied, but the logic was the same. Staying meant waiting to be destroyed or captured on someone else's terms. Leaving meant risk, but also choice. If they could reach land, find a vessel, or exploit the chaos of collapsing control, survival was at least possible. The captain authorized the attempt. This was not desertion in the conventional sense. The U-boat itself was effectively finished. The remaining crew would still attempt to surrender or survive aboard it. The 7 men were not abandoning comrades so much as testing a different path through a collapsing system. They prepared quickly and quietly. Supplies were divided. Navigation instruments were selected. Weapons were minimal. The goal was evasion, not combat. There was no heroic speech, no ceremony, just practical decisions made under pressure. When the lifeboat was lowered into the water, there was no certainty that it would ever be seen again. The U-boat submerged and disappeared, carrying the rest of the crew toward an unknown fate. The 7 men pushed away into enemy-controlled waters with no orders, no clear destination, and no guarantee that the war would end before their supplies did. At that moment, the war narrowed to a single question. How far could initiative carry you when command had vanished? If you want the real end-of-war stories, where survival mattered more than orders, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. The decision to leave the U-boat was not made in a single moment. It emerged gradually, shaped by exhaustion, experience, and the absence of any authority that still made sense. By April 1945, the German Naval Command no longer functioned as a coherent command. Orders were delayed, incomplete, or blatantly disconnected from reality. Some U-boats were instructed to continue patrols in zones already saturated with Allied aircraft. Others were told to conserve fuel for missions that would never come. Communications from headquarters often contradicted what crews could see with their own eyes. The chain of command still existed on paper, but at sea it had dissolved. For U-boat crews, this collapse was uniquely dangerous. Submarine warfare depended on precise coordination, reliable intelligence, and strict discipline. When those elements vanished, submarines became liabilities rather than assets. A damaged boat without clear orders was not a weapon, it was a trap. The captain understood this before anyone else. His authority remained intact aboard the vessel, but it was authority without a future. He could order dives, adjust course, ration supplies, but he could not change the strategic reality. The boat could not reach a friendly port. It could not fight. It could not hide indefinitely. Every decision delayed the inevitable without improving the outcome. That was the context in which the idea of escape was discussed, not mutiny, not abandonment of duty. Escape, the difference mattered. Mutiny implied rebellion against command. Escape implied the absence of meaningful command altogether. The captain was no longer issuing orders toward victory or even survival as a unit. He was managing decline. The men understood that distinction intuitively. The proposal was simple in concept and extreme in execution. A small group would leave the U-boat in a lifeboat, carrying only essential supplies. Their objective was not a specific destination, but opportunity. They would navigate toward areas of heavy maritime traffic, abandoned vessels, or coastal zones where chaos might offer concealment. The plan relied on unpredictability rather than planning. Only a small number could go. Lifeboat capacity was limited. Supplies were limited. More men meant greater visibility and faster exhaustion. 7 was not symbolic. It was practical. It was the maximum number that could be supported without guaranteeing failure. Volunteering was not driven by ideology. By this stage of the war, ideological motivation had eroded almost completely among most naval crews. Survival, responsibility, and realism governed decisions. Some men chose to stay with the U-boat out of loyalty, habit, or belief that surrender aboard the vessel was still safer. Others volunteered because they believed the U-boat would not last another encounter. The captain did not order anyone to go. He allowed it. That permission is critical. It marked the quiet end of normal command authority. In earlier years of the war, leaving a U-boat would have been unthinkable except under direct emergency. In 1945, emergency had become permanent. The captain recognized that clinging to formal discipline no longer served his men. His authority shifted from enforcing orders to enabling survival. The preparation was deliberately minimal. The lifeboat carried a compass, limited charts, basic navigation tools, food, water, and emergency signaling equipment that they hoped never to use. Weapons were kept to a minimum. Combat was not an option. Any encounter with Allied forces had to be avoided or misdirected. The timing of departure was chosen carefully. Surfacing patterns were already constrained by air patrols. The lifeboat had to be launched under conditions that minimized detection. Weather mattered, light mattered, silence mattered. Even the sound of metal against water could attract attention. When the boat was lowered, there was no ceremony. The men understood that emotional gestures were a luxury they could not afford. They exchanged brief words with those staying behind, fully aware that this might be the last time they saw each other. There were no promises, no assumptions of reunion, just acknowledgement. Once the lifeboat cleared the hull, the U-boat became something else entirely. It was no longer their responsibility. Their world narrowed to the small craft beneath them and the water surrounding it. This was the point of no return. From that moment on, the 7 men were operating outside every structure that had governed their lives since the war began. No chain of command, no radio contact, no operational objective beyond survival. The war had stripped away rank and doctrine, leaving only judgment. What made this decision extraordinary was not its boldness, but its clarity. The men did not believe they were outsmarting the enemy. They believed they were outlasting a collapsing system. The distinction mattered. They were not attempting a feat of heroism. They were attempting to avoid becoming casualties of inertia. In the final weeks of the war, countless soldiers and sailors died because they continued to follow orders that no longer served any purpose. The 7 men in the lifeboat recognized that truth and acted on it. They accepted uncertainty over certainty of defeat. As the U-boat slipped away beneath the surface, its fate unresolved, the lifeboat drifted into waters controlled entirely by the enemy. There was no longer any distinction between front line and rear. Every direction carried risk. Every decision carried consequences that could not be appealed. They had exchanged the structured danger of submarine warfare for the unstructured danger of independence. And the sea does not forgive mistakes. Once the U-boat disappeared beneath the surface, the lifeboat entered a different war entirely. There was no longer any protection of steel, no depth to hide in, no engines powerful enough to outrun danger. The 7 men were exposed to the elements and to an enemy that controlled the sea, the air above it, and most of the coastline ahead. Every hour afloat increased the risk of discovery. Every decision carried consequences that could not be undone. Navigation was the first and most persistent problem. The charts they carried were incomplete and outdated, intended for emergency reference rather than sustained travel. Precise positions were difficult to fix. Cloud cover obscured stars. The compass was reliable, but direction alone did not guarantee safety. Minefields shifted. Patrol routes changed daily. What had been a quiet sector a week earlier could now be lethal. They avoided predictable routes instinctively. Shipping lanes offered the chance of rescue or capture, but also the highest likelihood of immediate destruction if misidentified. Allied forces were still operating under combat rules. A small craft emerging unexpectedly could be interpreted as a decoy, a suicide attack, or a mine layer. There was no guarantee that surrender would be recognized in time. The men, therefore, chose isolation over contact. They stayed low, kept movement minimal, and used darkness to cover distance. During daylight hours, the lifeboat drifted whenever possible, conserving energy and reducing visibility. Oars were used sparingly. Silence mattered. Sound traveled easily over water, and aircraft could appear without warning. Exposure became the next threat. April waters were cold, even when the air seemed mild. Prolonged dampness weakened the body and slowed reaction time. Sleep came in short intervals, often interrupted by the need to watch the horizon or adjust position. Food and water were rationed tightly. Hunger was tolerated. Dehydration was not. Fatigue altered judgment. Small decisions began to feel heavy. Course corrections were debated longer than necessary. The absence of hierarchy meant that consensus had to be reached repeatedly. That slowed action, but it also prevented reckless choices. The men were acutely aware that one mistake could end the attempt immediately. Psychologically, the drift was punishing. There was no feedback loop, no confirmation that choices were correct. They could not know whether they were avoiding danger or drifting toward it. The sea offered no reassurance. Each dawn that revealed empty water brought both relief and dread. Relief that they had not been discovered. Dread that nothing had changed. Aircraft sightings were the most dangerous moments. The sound of engines triggered instant stillness. The lifeboat was positioned to minimize reflection. Any metallic object was covered. No signals were used. The men did not wave. They did not call out. Survival depended on not being noticed at all. At least once, an aircraft passed close enough that individual features were visible. The lifeboat remained motionless. Whether it was seen and dismissed or simply overlooked was impossible to know. The result was the same. They remained alive. Mines were a quieter threat, but no less deadly. The waters near ports and approaches were heavily seeded, and minefields were not static. Storms shifted them, moorings broke. Drifting mines could appear where charts indicated safety. Avoidance depended on luck as much as observation. The men watched the water constantly. Any unusual shape or line was treated as a potential hazard. Detours were taken even when fuel and strength were low. Better to lose hours than to risk seconds. As days passed, the original plan to reach land or opportunity became more abstract. The men were no longer moving toward a clear goal. They were reacting, adjusting, enduring. The war had narrowed further, from strategy to survival, from survival to moment-by-moment judgment. It was during this phase that the critical shift occurred. Late in the drift, signs of heavy maritime activity began to appear. Distant smoke, wreckage, occasional silhouettes on the horizon that vanished before identification. The sea itself was telling a story. Something had happened nearby, a battle, an evacuation, a withdrawal. Abandoned equipment began to surface, floating debris, empty boats, items that suggested hurried departure rather than destruction. This changed the calculation. Abandoned vessels were dangerous, but they were also opportunity. A ship left behind intact was a resource beyond anything a lifeboat could provide. Shelter, navigation tools, engines, range, control. Approaching such a vessel was a gamble. It could be a trap. It could be mined. It could be observed. But ignoring it meant continuing a drift that could end anywhere, including nowhere. The men debated briefly. Fatigue sharpened the discussion rather than dulling it. They understood the stakes clearly. Staying in the lifeboat meant prolonged exposure with diminishing supplies. Investigating a vessel meant immediate risk with the possibility of transformation. They chose movement. The lifeboat altered course toward the last known position of the sighting. Oars were used carefully. Speed was sacrificed for silence. The horizon was scanned constantly. No assumption was made that the vessel was empty. As they closed the distance, the outline became clearer. It was not a merchant ship. It was a warship, and it appeared to be unattended. At that moment, the nature of the escape changed completely. What had begun as survival was about to become something else entirely. The ship was unmistakably a warship, even from a distance. Its profile cut sharply against the horizon, low and angular, with the long, lean silhouette of a destroyer built for speed and pursuit. This was not a drifting hulk or a wreck. It sat upright in the water, riding evenly, showing no obvious signs of battle damage. That alone made it dangerous. A ship like this should not have been empty. The 7 men slowed their approach. A destroyer was both salvation and death. If crewed, it meant instant capture or gunfire. If abandoned but trapped, it could be mined or rigged for demolition. If recently evacuated, nearby patrols might still be in the area. Every possibility was bad. Only one was extraordinary. They circled at distance, watching for movement. No smoke rose from the funnels. No signal flags flew. No wake disturbed the water. The decks were silent. Even in wartime, a ship left completely unattended was rare. Warships were not abandoned lightly. They represented too much material, too much effort, too much pride. The circumstances of April 1945 explained the anomaly. German naval withdrawals were often rushed. Crews were ordered to scuttle vessels to prevent capture, but scuttling required time, explosives, and discipline. In chaotic retreats, especially near collapsing ports or under air threat, ships were sometimes left behind when destruction orders could not be carried out properly. A destroyer without fuel, ammunition, or clear orders might be evacuated hastily, with the assumption that it would be dealt with later. Later never came. The lifeboat drew closer. The men listened for any sound that would betray hidden crew or approaching patrols. There was none. The destroyer loomed larger now, its hull scarred by wear but intact. Boarding it would require climbing, exposure, and commitment. Once they committed, retreat would be difficult. They waited until dusk. Timing mattered. Boarding in full daylight risked detection from the air. Night reduced visibility, but increased danger aboard an unfamiliar ship. They chose the margin between, when shadows lengthened and the sea darkened without becoming blind. The approach was slow and deliberate. The lifeboat was brought alongside the destroyer's hull, staying clear of obvious access points until the last moment. One man climbed first, cautiously, weapon ready, but finger off the trigger. He listened. Nothing. He signaled the others. They boarded quickly, spreading out to secure immediate spaces, the bridge, the engine room access, radio compartments. Each was checked in silence. There were signs of recent occupation, discarded equipment, opened lockers, unfinished tasks, but no people. The ship had been abandoned, not destroyed. That discovery did not bring relief. It brought urgency. An abandoned destroyer was a prize, but also a liability. If it had been left intentionally, it might be expected to be sunk by air patrols. If its absence was noticed, search efforts could be directed toward it. Time mattered. The next question was whether the ship could move. Destroyers were complex machines, designed to be operated by crews numbering in the hundreds. Engines, power systems, navigation equipment, and weapons required coordination. 7 men could not fight the ship, but they did not need to. They needed it to sail. They moved to the engine room. The machinery was intact. Power systems had been shut down but not sabotaged. Fuel levels were uncertain, but there was enough to attempt movement. Restarting the engines would require knowledge, patience, and luck. Any mistake could immobilize the ship permanently or signal its presence to enemy forces. The men worked methodically. These were not amateurs. They were sailors trained in naval systems, even if not destroyer specialists. Knowledge of procedure mattered more than expertise. Switches were checked, valves were opened, systems were brought online in sequence. When the engines turned over, the sound was thunderous compared to the lifeboat. The destroyer came alive beneath them. That sound carried risk. It could be heard for miles, but it also meant possibility. With propulsion restored, the nature of the escape changed completely. They were no longer drifting. They were commanding speed, range, and direction. The destroyer could outrun most patrol craft. It could maneuver through weather that would swamp a lifeboat. It could reach land quickly or disappear into open water. They did not celebrate. There was no time. The next challenge was identity. A destroyer without a crew was suspicious. A destroyer moving without signals was dangerous. A destroyer moving under the wrong flag was suicidal. The men had to decide how the ship would present itself to the world, knowing that any mistake could bring immediate destruction. They took stock of what the ship offered: flags, signal equipment, radio systems, charts, codes. If any had been left behind, every item was evaluated for usefulness and risk. Using the radio could expose them instantly. Remaining silent could draw suspicion. They chose silence. Weapons were left unmanned. Engaging in combat was not an option. Any exchange would attract overwhelming force. The destroyer would be a vessel of avoidance, not confrontation. As night settled fully, the ship slipped away from its original position. Its course was chosen carefully, avoiding known patrol routes and heavily trafficked areas. Speed was moderated to reduce wake and noise. Lights remained off. For the first time since leaving the U-boat, the 7 men were not merely surviving, they were moving with intent. The lifeboat had given them a chance. The destroyer gave them power, but power attracts attention. And the most dangerous phase of the escape was still ahead. Once the destroyer was underway, the danger did not decrease. It changed shape. Speed and mobility solved one problem, but created another: visibility. A warship underway is not anonymous. Its silhouette can be identified from miles away. Its wake announces movement. Its presence invites attention from aircraft, patrols, and radar operators trained to treat anything unexpected as hostile until proven otherwise. The 7 men understood that they could not outrun the war. They had to pass through it unnoticed. Their first decision was restraint. The destroyer was capable of high speed, but they avoided it. Excessive speed created a larger wake and drew the eye. Moderate, consistent movement blended more easily into background traffic. They chose routes that skirted known patrol zones and avoided predictable lines of approach. This required judgment rather than certainty. Charts helped, but late-war conditions changed faster than maps could be updated. Identity was the most dangerous variable. A German destroyer flying German colors in April 1945 was a legitimate target everywhere. Flying no flag at all was equally dangerous. Neutral flags were an option, but using one incorrectly could be worse than none. The men had to decide whether to present themselves at all or remain ambiguous. They chose ambiguity. No signals were broadcast. The radio remained silent. Running lights stayed off, except when absolutely necessary. The destroyer became a moving shadow, relying on timing and distance rather than deception alone. Silence was their primary defense. Aircraft encounters were the greatest threat. Allied air patrols dominated the sea lanes, especially near coastlines and choke points. A destroyer spotted from the air would be classified quickly. Recognition would lead to attack before questions were asked. The men adjusted course repeatedly to avoid areas where air cover was heaviest, even when that meant longer routes and increased fuel consumption. When aircraft were heard, engines were throttled back. Course changes were made gradually to avoid abrupt maneuvers that might attract attention. The ship's profile was minimized against the horizon whenever possible. These were not foolproof measures. They were habits born of experience and desperation. Luck played a role, but luck alone does not explain survival. Allied forces were operating at a tempo that strained even their own systems. Late-war patrols were focused on preventing escape by high-value targets and suppressing remaining organized resistance. A single destroyer moving quietly without engaging anyone did not always register as an immediate priority, especially if it did not behave aggressively. The destroyer also benefited from chaos. In the final weeks of the war, the sea was crowded with movement that did not fit neat categories. Evacuations, surrender movements, scuttled ships, refugees, and confused orders created noise in the operational picture. Not every anomaly was investigated immediately. Not every contact was pursued to resolution. The 7 men exploited that uncertainty by avoiding behavior that would force a decision. They did not approach ports openly. They did not attempt contact. They did not linger in any one area. Movement was continuous but cautious, always favoring withdrawal over assertion. Fuel management became a constant concern. Without knowing exact reserves, every hour of operation mattered. Speed was adjusted to balance progress with conservation. Detours were weighed against the risk of exposure. There was no margin for error. Running out of fuel would leave them adrift again, this time in a vessel far more visible than a lifeboat. Fatigue returned in a new form. Operating a destroyer with 7 men required constant work. Watches had to be maintained, engines monitored, navigation checked repeatedly. There was no relief crew. Sleep came in fragments. Mistakes became more likely as exhaustion deepened. The psychological strain was intense. Any distant aircraft could be the end. Any silhouette on the horizon could be a patrol closing in. The men lived in a state of controlled tension, alert but restrained, knowing that panic would be as dangerous as complacency. At no point did they attempt to use the destroyer's weapons. Firing even a single shot would have transformed them from anomaly to threat. The ship's guns remained silent, covered, unused. Power was survival, not dominance. As days passed, the absence of interception began to feel unreal. Each successful passage through a dangerous zone reinforced the same conclusion. Caution was working. The destroyer was doing what the lifeboat could not, moving through enemy-controlled space without forcing engagement. Eventually, the war around them began to thin. Patrol density decreased. Signals of collapse became more obvious. The front lines were no longer clearly defined. Authority fractured further. The sense of immediate pursuit faded. When contact finally occurred, it was not violent. The destroyer was intercepted under conditions that allowed identification without immediate fire. By then, the men were prepared. They had no intention of resisting. Survival had been the objective from the beginning, not escape at all costs. The ship was taken without incident. The journey ended not in a firefight, but in silence. That outcome explains why the story is rarely told. There was no battle, no last stand, no dramatic victory. 7 men navigated the collapse of a war by refusing to behave like soldiers once soldiering no longer made sense. They survived not by defiance, but by restraint. And in war, restraint is harder to recognize than heroism. When the destroyer was finally intercepted, there was no dramatic conclusion, no gunfire, no last-minute reversal, no attempt to escape. The 7 men did not resist, because resistance had never been the point. By the time Allied forces took control of the ship, the war had already lost its shape. What remained was administration. They were processed as prisoners of war. Interrogations followed, but they were not theatrical. Allied intelligence officers were accustomed to unusual end-of-war stories. What mattered was verification, where the ship came from, whether it posed any remaining threat, whether the men represented a larger pattern of organized escape. Once it became clear that this was an isolated act of survival rather than a coordinated operation, interest diminished rapidly. The destroyer itself was examined, catalogued, and removed from consideration. In April and May of 1945, Allied forces were absorbing vast quantities of captured equipment. One more abandoned vessel did not merit extended attention unless it offered technical intelligence. This one did not. It was functional, but not unique. The sailors were dispersed through the normal prisoner system. There were no medals, no trials, no special status. They were not treated as heroes, but neither were they singled out as criminals. From the Allied perspective, they were simply men who had outlived their command. That classification explains why the story faded so quickly. Post-war narratives rely on clarity. They require beginnings, climaxes, and endings that fit established frames. This episode resisted all 3. There was no official order authorizing the escape, no recognized mission. No victory or defeat in conventional terms. The men did not act in the name of the Reich, nor against it. They acted in the absence of it. That made the story inconvenient. For Germany, the late-war naval narrative focused on collapse, surrender, and destruction. U-boats were remembered either as instruments of terror earlier in the war or as doomed relics hunted to extinction by Allied technology. A story about sailors quietly abandoning doctrine and surviving through initiative complicated that picture. It suggested agency where defeat narratives preferred inevitability. For the Allies, the end-of-war story emphasized control. Victory was portrayed as systematic, overwhelming, and orderly. Enemy forces surrendered en masse. Resistance ended. Chaos was contained. An episode in which 7 enemy sailors independently seized a warship and moved through Allied-controlled waters without engagement did not fit comfortably inside that image. So, the story was filed, not celebrated. There were no incentives to preserve it. No government needed it. No institution benefited from it. It offered no moral lesson that could be easily summarized. It did not confirm ideological righteousness or technological supremacy. It showed something more ambiguous, that in the final days of war, survival often depended less on allegiance than on judgment. This is why such stories surface only rarely, usually in fragments, personal recollections, obscure naval reports, marginal notes in interrogation files. They exist at the edges of history because they challenge the idea that wars end when treaties are signed or flags are lowered. For the men themselves, reintegration was uneven. They returned to civilian life, carrying an experience that did not translate into status or recognition. They had not fought a battle. They had not surrendered immediately. They had not followed orders to the end. They had simply refused to wait for the system to finish collapsing on top of them. That refusal carried no official reward. The larger truth revealed by this episode is uncomfortable but consistent. Large institutions collapse slowly at the top and suddenly at the bottom. Orders continue long after they stop making sense. Authority persists on paper even when it no longer protects those expected to obey it. In that environment, the line between duty and futility becomes blurred. The 7 sailors crossed that line consciously. They did not rebel. They did not defect. They stepped outside a structure that had ceased to function and accepted the risks of autonomy. Most soldiers never get that chance. Most die or surrender within the framework they are given. This story survived only because it ended quietly. Had the destroyer been sunk, the men would have vanished into statistics. Had they fired a shot, they would have become a footnote in combat reports. Because they chose restraint, their passage left almost no trace. Silence preserved them and erased them. That erasure is not accidental. History remembers wars through decisions made at the top and battles fought at scale. It forgets the small acts of judgment that determine who lives long enough to see peace. Yet those acts are often the most revealing because they show what happens when ideology, command, and structure fall away. What remains is human calculation. The last weeks of World War II were filled with such calculations, made far from conference tables and victory speeches. This episode is one of them. 7 men, a lifeboat, an abandoned destroyer, and a war that had already ended in every way except on paper. They did not change the outcome. They changed their own. And sometimes that is the only victory left. Wars don't end when orders stop making sense. They end when people decide how much risk they're willing to take to survive. If you want the overlooked stories of World War II, the ones that happened after command collapsed and history stopped paying attention, subscribe to WW2 Declassified.